Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. This week, we're going to be looking at conscience and morality. Now, a lot of times when you engage folks with the discussions on objective morality, people say there's no such thing as absolute good and evil. I mean, there's all kinds of ideas out there of what's right and what's wrong, and it varies from culture to culture. Well, this is true to some extent. I mean, in one culture, you may have an individual who believes it's right to only marry one woman, and in another culture, you may have someone who believes it's okay to marry multiple women. Yet there are also limits on these ideas, for in no culture is it ever right to marry another person's wife. So while you have ideas of right and wrong that may seem to be in flux, there's actually an undergirding bedrock of understanding across all of human culture. And a lot of this is due to the idea of conscience. That's what we want to explore today. Now, I was in the studio just a couple of months ago with the guys from apologetics.com, and that's what we're going to be bringing you, our discussion on conscience, our moral compass. I hope you enjoy it, and let's get started on this Come Let Us Reason Together.
Good morning and welcome to the apologetics.com radio show. I am your host for the evening, Harry Edwards. We were here last week, Jacob, right? So yes. We're back again, but this time we have Lenny Esposito with us.
Yeah, I get to join.
Yeah. Lenny, when was the last time you were here?
Well, we took a little holiday break, so it was November. Of course, over Christmas, I got a small bout of COVID, but that wasn't too terrible.
I don't think anyone was spared that.
Yeah, I don't think either they haven't been or they won't be at some point, it seems.
Yeah. No, I had it too. I know you've been busy with Come Reason Ministries.
Yes.
Tell us what's the latest.
Just been going around. The speaking has started to pick up again, which is nice, even though, we're seeing this Omicron wave, I think that's starting to diminish, but got a busy year ahead of me looking at a conference in March, the end of March in Corona, California, that we're going to be putting on, Dare to Defend, and have mainline speakers, Sean McDowell, JP Moreland, Ken Samples, others going to be there. Jacob's going to do a session for us in one of our breakouts. It'd be nice. So you can get tickets even right now. Go to daretodefend.com or comereason.com, and you can buy your tickets, check out the lineup, and hope to see everyone there.
Great. So, yeah, that's going to be great. How about you, Jacob? How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Yeah, just keeping busy. I'm grateful for all the opportunities God is still opening up, as you said, Lenny, regardless of what's going on in terms of coronavirus and Omicron and everything. But yeah, grateful for all the opportunities that's there. And I was telling Lenny a while ago that I'm currently devoting much of my time in terms of developing, I might have mentioned this earlier as well, the whole church-based academy thing.
That's great.
So I'm devoting a lot of time into that, basically giving it a structure which could be appealing to the churches and pastors and ministers to really adopt that. And I think it's very much needed in terms of understanding the need for cultural exegesis alongside biblical exegesis that we do.
Yeah. And that's actually going to fit very well with our show this evening, because we think, and later that's going to be toward the end, strategies for culture change.
Yeah.
Because that's what's needed on top of just like salvific assurance, right? Gospel. If you have been listening to our podcasts, every third Sunday I have Jacob and Lenny, and we have been for several months now discussing Paul Gould's book, Cultural Apologetics. And I highly recommend it, and it's been fun reading it and rereading it. And so now we've come to chapter 6. We want to talk about conscience. Now, the first part of the book, first part of the chapter talks about longing. And but we're going to skip over that, and we're going to go straight into how I titled this show, Conscience, Our Moral Compass. And again, as cultural apologists, we're mindful to always create common ground. We want to be able to converse with our seeker or skeptic and come to certain agreements before we, do a monologue of the 5 reasons why you should believe in God. I think, especially today, in today's culture, it's good to have a friendly, civil dialogue and to actually find out the starting points. And so one starting point is our conscience. No matter who you are, where you've lived, what cultural background you come from, male, female, whatever, every human being has a conscience. Some have good consciences, some have bad consciences, but we do have a conscience. And I want to say and I want your thoughts on this, even with the fall, I think, meaning even when sin entered our world, right? And we're now in our fallen state. And some of us are being renewed day by day. We call them Christians, right? But even in our struggles, wouldn't you say that our consciences serve as good guides for how to behave properly? What do you guys think?
Go ahead, Lenny.
Well, I think obviously, yes, in the sense that it shows that we have an understanding that there is a right and a wrong, that there are moral duties and obligations to which each individual must adhere or abide by. The specifics on those duties and obligations may vary from culture to culture, but there's actually and sociologists will tell you there's actually quite a lot of commonality that would surprise people. One culture may say a man should marry one wife. Another culture can say a man can marry many wives. There is no culture that says a man can take another man's wife. So there is some universality there. There is obvious in certain cultures where the idea of, especially in honor shame cultures, where you're disgraced the family because you were raped, say a young girl in an Islamic culture, even though she was a victim, she's considered damaged and disgraced the family name, and she brings shame on the family. There's problems with that, obviously, but the idea that there is a value system, and we know that there is a good and a bad out there. We may not be clear on exactly what that is, but I think it does a good job in showing us that we're moral beings, and we know that we fall short of the goodness we should be.
Right.
Providing.
Yeah, and I'll just add this to that, is that it kind of proves what the scripture tells us. Though we are broken and we are, there is depravity. I mean, it's not absolute, like in terms of like, it affects all aspects of our life, but doesn't actually. We are not absolutely depraved in that we are no more redeemable. That's not the case anymore. I think it confirms what Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 says, and it's very clear. It says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bear witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even accuse them."
Yeah.
Right? So it confirms that the way we are created, that we are created in God's image, and He has infused within us or created us in such a way that we do actually have that plumb line of conscience within us that measures itself on the basis of a certain kind of moral standard. And the question is, where do we get that standard from?
Yeah. So good segue, Jacob. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight is the moral, just where do moral values come from? We know they exist. If you're able to affirm that moral values exist, ultimately the conclusion is that God exists. So we want to cover the premises and the conclusion here. And I know Paul Gould in his book covered this. I think this is what we're attaching to conscience. The fact that we have, like you said, the moral law written on our hearts. If you're a C.S. Lewis fan, you probably know that you'll find this argument in Mere Christianity.
Harry, before you get into that,
Yeah.
I just want to make a slight distinction here, though. If we have maybe Christians and non-believers who are listening to us today, Scripture is very clear. It talks about the work of the law is written in the hearts of non-believers, whereas in the hearts of believers, He has written the law itself. And there is a huge difference there. And Scripture maintains that distinction clearly, and conscience tells us exactly which way to lean.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Before the show, we were talking about the just morality as an argument for the existence of God. You said that it's one of your favorites, right?
It is.
It is. Tell us why.
The very reason you mentioned, Harry, I think it translates into all cultures, all people. Wherever I've traveled quite a bit, I've lived in different countries, different cultures. I have found longings among people and their public behavior and how they want to conduct their society and life. As much as we may see a lot of, and as human beings, we tend to see contrast and differences easily. We don't get much appeal in terms of like seeing the commonalities, and I think there is much common among people around the world in terms of moral law that they esteem and want to be perfected by. So
yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's true. That's people get it. They
Yes.
understand it. You don't need to be, have a PhD in philosophy to understand that there are certain things that are internal and they guide you, and you kind of know the difference between good and bad.
imagine if there was no universality to the whole idea of moral law. Could you even travel outside to some other land, a different culture, and really survive there and be able to return to your own land?
Right.
I don't think that will even be possible.
That'd be kind of scary.
Yes.
Because you get there and you go, I wonder what they do here. Do they eat? What kinds of things do they eat? Do they eat animals or do they eat you or vegetables?
Eat each other. And you see these negative utopian ideas in the movies and in television, right? The first one that comes to mind is an old Star Trek episode called Amok Time, where they go into a parallel. Kirk goes into a parallel universe, and it's the evil version of the Enterprise, and everybody is trying to backstab each other just to get ahead. That's the whole goal. But the premise doesn't work. You have to have a universality idea of good, of progress. And I was in a debate with a philosophy prof on the moral law, on the moral argument, and he posits, what if there was an evil God? And, evil is just endemic to who he is. Why wouldn't, though, the things that we now label as evil and bad, why wouldn't they just be true? And I said, well, first of all, that can't be, because evil can't exist in and of itself. There's no such thing as pure evil. Every evil act has to have some good in it, even if that good is, seeking personal pleasure. Pleasure is a good in and of itself. It's only the way you try to achieve pleasure. If it's pleasure by torturing others, then that's the wrong way to go about it. But that doesn't make pleasure itself bad. But you can't think of anything that's purely evil and no good.
Yeah.
And so in order for societies to progress, in order for societies to work, you'd never get out of the Stone Age.
Yeah.
You'd be killing each other. There would be no, the species would basically exterminate itself. You can't not have this as a universal. It just doesn't exist.
Yeah. Again, if we're going to follow Augustine's line of thinking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, evil has no ontological
Right.
status, meaning it's not a thing.
It's a privation.
privation.
Although
It's
the guy I debated did not hold to evil as a privation, which I thought was fascinating. So,
I mean, he knew that and denied it, or
he knew. Yeah, he. I think he had a more Eastern view
okay.
of evil, which was interesting.
Yeah,
but still, he would use the Western concept to say God can't exist.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that's why I think we were talking about this a while ago, right? Within the Eastern world, that's why there's this emphasis on balancing your good and evil, because good is not good in itself, or evil is not evil in itself. You have to balance both so that you ultimately become part of this impersonal reality, which cannot judge because it's not a person.
In the bigger picture, and maybe we'll talk about this later, that kind of view is just not livable. And like you were saying, those who hold that, they actually long to be unshackled from that idea.
So what happens is that then in that case, you create a society that is, you encounter a lot of contrast and disparity. That's why in the Eastern world, if whoever travels, you can definitely see there are multi-billionaires doing innovations in technology and engaged in anything that you would see in the Western world. At the same time, contrasted with utter poverty. And there's a complete disregard for that kind of lifestyle at the same time, but it is continued in such a way that it is seen as part of that harmonizing a society with both. You're seeing evil and good together in such a way that you're trying to balance it so that there might be some kind of cosmic reward of our existence.
So even just a first glance analysis or critique of that just doesn't seem fair, right? Doesn't seem right as well.
And that's why the longing for justice, again, another thing which is common among all people in all cultures. We all long for justice. We somehow sense this, that ultimately there has to be something that is good, good that would bring about the true justice that we all long for.
This was actually the message that made Christianity so popular in the early modern world, in the early Roman world, I'm sorry. It was the idea that you didn't have to stay within your birth system. It's why Christianity was mocked initially by the Roman elite as the religion of women and slaves. That's how they would castigate it. But two things happened. First of all, they would try to quelch the message of Christianity, and Christians would happily go to their martyrdom rather than, deny Christ. And Roman society couldn't figure this out. It just didn't make sense. Just burn a little incense. What are you doing?
Yeah.
But they say, no, we serve something higher. And it's because of that we are all free. Even if we're slaves, we are free. And that's resonated so deeply with the slave class. 60-70% of the empire was enslaved or lower class. And then, of course, women didn't have near the authority of men. And so you heard them, they heard these Christians embrace that, and they saw this movement and they said, that will make me free, even if I'm in this. And that's why Christianity exploded. Yeah. I'm wondering if maybe, and we'll probably talk about this in the second half of the show, if that's a message we need to get back to.
Yeah, for sure. So hang in there if you're listening. We will definitely get to the benefits that Christianity has provided the world. But going back again to C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, he outlines his argument here, and Paul Gould in his book, he summarized the point. So I want to cover those 4 points or 3 points and then the conclusion, and look at each of the premises and see if they all follow, if they're sound and they're cogent. And maybe I might play devil's advocate and ask you guys some questions. But the first one is there is a universal moral law. So what do we mean by there is a universal moral law? What do we mean by that?
Well, just that everybody agrees that, killing babies for the fun of it is wrong. It's just, you should always, you should love your children. You should, you never take another man's wife. Things, though there are certain standards that we understand in our conscience that there's a right and a wrong way to do things, and we have an obligation as human beings to live up to those standards.
It seems like everybody also has the golden rule as part of their, moral.
To some degree.
Yeah, but there's a distinction there as well with the golden rule. The Christian worldview is very much proactive in the sense that do unto others as you would want them to do unto you.
Yeah.
Whereas the rest of the world, it's kind of the other way. Do not do unto others as you don't want them to do unto you.
So it's passive. And that
it's
does
passive.
make a difference. And matter of fact, it is, I remember reading in Buddhist theology, the practicing Buddhist will put a bowl of rice out on the doorstep because it benefits him to make sure that he's not incurring any karmic debt. And the Buddhist monk who's living a vow of poverty takes the rice because the vow of poverty is benefiting him in order to escape his karmic debt. Christianity, it's not that. It's if a man asks you to walk 1 mile, go with him 2. It's not to benefit you. It's, matter of fact, to serve him and benefit the other. So there is a very big, even though they sound the same, there's a very big distinction between those two.
An important and necessary distinction to maintain is that usually people tend to conflate two ideas of law, right? There's a law of the land, which might be very much relative in terms of the context of the land. I drive on the right-hand side here, and you drive on the left-hand side. But we all agree we shouldn't be driving over other people when they are crossing the road, right?
And that we should avoid each other so we don't get into accidents.
Exactly. Right. So there are two different kinds of laws. So when we are talking about the universal law, we are talking about the law in terms of that contributes to human flourishing at the end, in the manner in which the lawgiver, or whom we call God, has, or as he would want us to.
Okay, I want to move quickly because we're going to run out of time. You guys know that. But number 2, so we all agree that a universal moral law does exist. It applies to everybody, all times. The second premise, as summarized here, if there is a universal moral law, there is a moral lawgiver. So I know we were talking about this during the before our show here. And I guess you could posit, albeit unsuccessful, but you could imagine an impersonal lawgiver. Can you, is the question. Can you imagine a machine, if it's impersonal, it's not a person, right? Or a force?
Well, we have impersonal laws. They're called the laws of nature.
Yeah, okay.
And we call them that because they seem inviolable until, of course, somebody can figure out a way around them, right? If somebody invented an anti-gravity machine, nobody's going to say, "Oh, you can't break the law of gravity." It's like, no, I can. So why shouldn't I? So there's that kind of law is not morally binding. It's not prescriptive. It's descriptive. Right. Moral laws are prescriptive. They're what we should do, not just explaining what happens.
And that's a good distinction between natural law versus, let's say, a moral law.
Right.
Yeah.
Moral law is prescriptive. Natural law is descriptive. And if it's prescriptive, that means that there's somebody prescribing it.
Right.
It's
And I think the very fact that when we are saying moral laws are universal, then we have to then give that the standard that we are appealing universally has to be universal and above the individuals in the society as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What about let's say someone who invokes the Platonist atheist? As you know, Plato is famous for his forms, and let's just say properties are floating out there. Can moral laws just be properties not attached to persons? I can't even imagine.
They don't have any authority. I mean, what would? It's just again that becomes a description then, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And we were talking about this, that there has to be a certain kind of intentionality behind a certain kind of law that anyone is prescribed to follow. And how do we get that intentionality is when we can appeal to a person a personhood, right? Not anything impersonal.
Yeah.
One of the examples I give is that Harry say you are one of the most noble persons human history in the human history, and I'm the worst person you could imagine. And we are walking, into a room, and there's an open wire, electric wire, and we both step onto it, right? It's a force, and I think we both gonna get the same kind of jolt, electric, shock. It's not going to judge whether you are a good person or I'm a bad person. There's ultimately going to be the same kind of end for both of us. And I think that's how it is. I mean, with moral law, we have to assume that there is this point of justice that needs to be met. And that has to happen through a judgment. An impersonal being or impersonal thing doesn't judge. And there can't be any intentionality when a law is prescribed.
Yeah, that's why karma doesn't make much sense, because who's prescribing the laws? Who's doing the judging?
Right.
It's this impersonal universal force, but how can it do that?
So the third premise is, and I think we covered this already, gentlemen, but if there is a moral lawgiver, it must be something beyond the material cosmos.
Yeah, intentionality, as Jacob said, intentionality is an attribute of a mind.
Yeah,
and it's only an attribute of a mind. There nothing else can be intentional.
Hey, that's simple enough. So we affirm that it can't be a material thing. It cannot be a material. It has to be a person. Conclusion is, therefore, there is something beyond the material cosmos.
That exercises intentionality, that is a mind that has a moral understanding itself. It's a person. It's a person,
and has a will,
for us as well as So it's an immaterial person whose morality comes from itself. Therefore, you can label it as all good, and has an authority over us, so that we need to obey the moral laws that it's prescribing to us.
And I would even just add, as believers in Christ, the fact that throughout the scripture we read that the moral law or the nature of God that we are talking about is an extension of the fact that He is a loving God.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what makes it even more beautiful and sustainable.
Well, I hear the music playing, and so if you're listening to us, we want to make sure that you come back after a few messages from our sponsors. All right. Well, welcome back to the Apologetics.com radio show. My name is Harry Edwards. I'm your host for this evening. We've been talking about moral values and how that points to God. And we talked about how it's one of our favorites because people get it. We can all relate to it. We know what our consciences do. We know good versus bad. And so I know in chapter 6 of Paul Gould's book, he talks a little bit about, or maybe in another, readings, but it's so ubiquitous. It's not even complicated. The fact that we are guided by a set of moral values that atheists, all right. Now, and by the way, we're not claiming that people who don't know the Lord are morally corrupt. We're not.
Matter of fact, that's an interesting point because atheists complain about that. They make that objection all the time. Are you saying that I'm immoral?
Right.
And they're offended by it, which actually proves the point. That hey, you obviously do have an understanding of morality,
and they do accept it. It's just when you say absolute moral values, that's where they object. But even some atheists, they don't even brush it aside because they know that moral values do exist. But some have said it's illusory.
Yeah, Michael Roos.
That's Michael Roos. I guess one of the more popular ones is the Darwinian model, where
morality helps us survive.
That's right. Yeah. It helps us survive. But beyond that, it can't say anything. And by the way, I mean, they're also perplexed if you just ask the question, well, why is survival anything?
Yeah.
Why survive?
That's the question that I generally ask.
Why is that a value?
I said, wait a minute, maybe.
Yeah.
Are you telling me that the asteroid was evil when it knocked out the dinosaurs and caused that great extinction event? Maybe we should just create nuclear war and let the cockroaches have the earth. Maybe it's their time to survive.
That's right.
And the other question would be, does an immoral act, if it leads to someone's survival, becomes a moral act?
Yeah, not necessarily. It's just because I'm eating dinner doesn't mean I'm doing a moral good.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So, again, we've been skirting around the conclusion, but it really lands on, so if there is something beyond the material cosmos, well, what you were describing a while ago, Lenny, sounds like God to me, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing left, really. I mean, that you're talking about.
This object beyond the material cosmos is God. I mean, that's just what it is.
And not just any God, has to be a personal
God.
Yeah.
As opposed to, let's say, the God of the Hindus, which is many.
And so it's basically a pantheistic worldview. At the same time, it's a mix of different worldviews. There is a notion of ultimate reality, which is one, right? But it kind of like permeates into all of our existence. But this ultimate reality is an impersonal God who has this emanation of personal beings through whom justice is done. So when it comes to good and evil, one of the common terms, which is very much understood here in the West, but it's in a different way, is the whole idea of karma, right? If you do some evil in this life, you have to come back in a lower form to basically repay, right? And do some good works. But if you do good works in this life, you have to come back again. Why? Because you need to be reaping the rewards of the good work that you have done. So a goal of a Hindu is neither to do good or evil, but to have a balance in their life. Why? Because they themselves are the captain of the ship, that they have to lead to the ultimate point of justice. Because this ultimate reality, who is impersonal, cannot actually give them any justice.
Right. So again, you mentioned how that's why longing in that culture is very real. Because their current worldview just can't support a flourishing life.
The longing is common, regardless of where you go. The longing for justice, the longing for human dignity, the longing for significance. I have never met a single person who would deny the fact that they have all these three.
Yeah. And again, that's another C.S. Lewis thing, the whole longing. We talked about this in previous shows. Yeah. That if in general, if you long for something, there must be something that ought to satisfy it. Yeah. So if you're hungry, there must be food to satisfy my hunger. And
from a Christian worldview, I would say there is a who satisfies, and not just something.
So I want to segue with all of this, since we're talking about moral values, and as you know, especially atheists online, they like to point out all of the evil that Christians have done, and we talk a big game, so to speak, right? But then when we look at our history, at least how the atheists and skeptics, how they view our history, they would accuse Christianity of all sorts of evil. So they would just mention the Crusades or the Inquisition or the witch burnings, How would you guys respond to that? So, in fact, I did find the quote. Os Guinness, who is a popular evangelical leader and social critic, he said this of the church, actually. He goes, "The church is a leading spawning ground for atheists." Now, you need to understand where he's coming from. Of course, he loves the church. But as you know, like, for instance, I know a Barna poll was conducted a few years ago, and it showed that 87% of young people who leave the church is because they say that the church is judgmental and the church is hypocritical. I think we need to acknowledge that. But let's go on to some of the exaggerated claims with the Crusades. I know, Lenny, you said you had a good response for that. So if somebody says, well, what about the Crusades,
Yeah. Well, the first point that one must realize is it's what is known in logic as a tu quoque. In other words, just because there's one wrong, saying, well, you did it too, is not an answer. You know, the Christians did the Crusades too, so they were evil. So therefore, that doesn't prove that there's no God or that evil doesn't exist. And what I tell everybody is, the first rule in understanding any belief system is you never judge a belief system by its abuse. And that's just fair. I'm not going to judge you by atheists like, you know, maybe Dawkins when he gropes the lady in the elevator, or the atheist who starts shooting people up, you know, and you shouldn't judge Christians who don't do what Jesus did or violate Jesus' law. If Jesus is the standard and we don't live up to it, most Christians try, some are drastically violating that law. But the Crusades specifically, there's a lot of misunderstanding. First of all, it wasn't, there seems to be a picture out there that the Crusades were Christians invading Muslim lands. That's not the case. What happened was there was hundreds of years of Muslim aggression prior to the Crusades. Those were Christian cities. Antioch, Jerusalem, right? Matter of fact, the Eastern Orthodox Church still talks about the Jerusalem Sea, the Antioch Sea. These were Christian cities that Muslims invaded, and the Christians were mounting a response to save their brethren.
Yeah. After hundreds of years,
After hundreds of years.
Right.
And Scott Thong writes a timeline. 634, Muslim invasion of Byzantine Christian Empire, Palestine. By 652, they're occupying Christian Sicily and Italy. They invade Nubia in 700. They attack and invade Spain, Portugal, and Gibraltar, and they try to invade France in 711 AD, but Charlemagne stops that, kicks them back.
They went all the way to Asia too, if I'm not mistaken.
1064, Muslims invade West Asia. The Turkish Muslims attack Asia Minor and Syria. Again, those were the 7 churches that John planted that was fully Christianized by that time. In 1095, the First Crusade begins. So from 634 to 1095, it's nearly 400 years of Muslim aggression. And it's that when the Christians, okay, we got to go and try and rescue our brethren.
Right.
So that's what they were. And most crusaders weren't going for the goal. As a matter of fact, it impoverished most people. Yeah. It was really a bad scene. And it's just a myth. Now, did Christians react, and did some Christians do very evil things by the time the 4th, 5th Crusade rolled around? Yes, absolutely. They're in this point in time, they were just as bloodthirsty in their warfare as anybody else, and they were part of the culture of their day, and they responded to Muslim aggression with overabundance of Christian aggression, and they were held accountable to that. So I'm not disputing that horrible things happened, but I am saying that wasn't initially Christian aggression that caused the Crusades. It was a response.
Right. And in fact, for a while, Muslims took it all back anyways, like in 1187, if my history serves me right. So, so there's that.
Constantinople held up until the 14th century. It was, Constantine was a brilliant military strategist. He looked around Rome and said, I can't protect, there's 7 hills that the high ground the enemies would be on. I can't protect this place. I'm moving it. And he moved it to Constantinople. And that was obviously a brilliant move because it took the Muslims forever to try and break through that. But they finally did.
Yeah, exactly. They did. So again, the number of deaths is also exaggerated. And maybe now's a good time if we're just going to compare deaths from Christians and deaths from atheists, maybe let's do that comparison. I know there's an interesting book that catalogs all of the wars in human history. Of all the wars in human history, about 6% of them are religious in nature. Most of them are not religious. They use religion. The
leaders used, but they were looking for power or land.
Right.
So it's an exaggeration to say
ethnic strife.
Yeah, all of that kind of thing.
In fact, you said 6%,
6%, but of the 6%, half of those are Muslim in character. The other half is all the other faiths.
Interesting.
That's
close to the numbers I found. It was like 1% if you're going to account for all of the different changes. 1% would be attributed to the Crusades, Inquisitions, the witch burnings.
Yeah.
When you compare that to Stalin, Mao, and Hitler.
Oh yeah, not even a comparison. Those guys killed more people in the 20th century than most of the world.
Well, here's a number. So we think Hitler, right? That's who we think of as like the mass murderer, despot, whatever. But his number is about 10 million. Well, that's nothing compared to Stalin, which is twice for Stalin. Mao is 70 million.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yes, 70. So among the three of them already, you got 100 million compared to, let's say, the Inquisitions, the Crusades, and the witch burnings, probably 200,000. That's the number I came up with. But again, this is powerful because we're not even mentioning Lenin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Pol Pot, Ceausescu, Fidel Castro, and Kim Jong-un. We're not even mentioning those guys, but
or Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great. Pick anyone through history.
Really, the comparison's not even there. So hopefully, our listeners find this persuasive and powerful. So next time somebody says, "Well, what about the Crusades? What about the Inquisitions?" Just in history, it's evident that Christians were just defending their lands at that point. Let's go to the brighter side of things. Christianity being a force for good, for human flourishing. What are some of the examples that you guys find there?
I think one of the major contributions and gifts of the Christian world to the rest of the world was the fact that the shift in terms of governance of people, right? Even today, if we see much of the tension between nations is between two ideas, the idea of nation as being sovereign nation, and then the idea of imperialism. And I think Christianity brought about that major shift in terms of understanding that nation is an idea within boundary, that they are sovereign in terms of ruling people, right? The very idea, the American idea of we the people, where do we get that idea from? Very much from the Reformation, the idea that the priesthood of all believers, right? And then you conduct your nation in such a way that ultimately it's meant to be discipled and then glorify God, as I would say. But I think this idea of nation, people don't talk about this, especially here in the West. I'm surprised that people have no idea that in the 20th century, we see the kind of nations that are standing as sovereign nation. It's all because of the very Christian idea of what nation is like. It was an end to this idea of imperialism going and spreading this idea of or having control over other lands. But at the same time, God in human history has even used that to bring about the good. Christians are the ones who have championed in terms of education. Paul Gould talks about that. The modern universities were set up by the Christians, right? They cared for the creation, and therefore what they did was gave rise to the idea of modern science. We don't see those coming out in cultures that hold to a different worldview, but we do see that Christians have contributed a lot.
Yeah, and let's get into specifics. So, for example, infanticide. Infanticide is a practice that was actually replete in the ancient world. It was practiced widely, even in the so-called elevated eras of Rome. You had children who were abandoned by the Tiber. We even have a letter from a Roman gentleman who was out on a business trip. His wife was ready to be delivered. And he says, I hope to be home by the time that you have the child. If it's a son, keep it. If it's a daughter, discard it. And the Christians would be coming by and they'd scoop these babies up off the river because they were made in the image of God. And it, again, puzzled the Romans. Because if you're in an agrarian society, every child you have would be a net benefit, right? You got another farmhand, unless the child was sickly or crippled then it's a net negative because you have to feed the child, which means that there's less food for everybody else. And when you're not even sure that you're going to have one meal a day, maybe you don't know that, to put another mouth on the table, that's rough. So, and girls, of course, you had to pay a dowry. They were, they were seen as less valuable. So you saw this process in China when the one child policy came out. You saw, again, women were was almost a 2-to-1 ratio of boys being born, and they'd have abortions for the girls. Christianity flipped that. It instilled the idea that, so the first orphanages were Christians. When the plagues hit, and Tertullian and the Eusebius and the Christian historians that talk about when all of the Roman aristocracy was fleeing to their country villas, leaving their sick relatives behind, it was the Christians who were running in. And Rodney Stark says it may very well be that Christianity became dominant because of two things. First of all, the Christians would develop, now some would die because of the disease, right, but others who were in there would develop immunity toward it, and they wouldn't have to worry about it. Secondly, the people whom they nursed, who were not even believers, remembered that.
Yeah, became believers.
and all of a sudden it's like, my Uncle Zeke took off, but you, a stranger, helped me.
Yeah.
First hospitals were Christian.
Yeah.
Christian elevated women like no aspect had before. When Paul writes, you're neither slave nor free, male nor female, Jew nor Greek, that was earth-shattering. So much so that you have guys like Tom Holland, who's an agnostic. He's not even a believer. He writes this huge tome saying how Christianity single-handedly shaped our understanding of what the world is and what goodness is in Western society. And he was in love with the idea of ancient history till he really started studying the Romans and the Greeks. And he got, oh my gosh, these people are barbarians. I couldn't have lived with them. They're just savages. Yeah. It's the Christianity that made the difference.
Even today, if you travel to maybe to Africa or to the Eastern world, and you say if you fall sick, you go to a hospital, and what kind of hospital you would go to?
Yeah, I laugh.
Set up by Christians.
I laugh when the anthropologist on the History Channel talks about the ancient Amazonian tribes who have a small footprint, and if there's a child that's sick, they may slaughter a chicken, but you have to understand that there's a little bit of arrogance there, because if he gets yellow fever, he's not going to settle for the guy slaughtering a chicken for him. He's going to go to the nearest Western medical clinic as soon as he can to get treated for, all of that stuff.
And I also asked tell me about a Christian charity or a major organization that goes around the world and helps people regardless of their faith.
Right.
But show me one Muslim organization, that a major international organization that goes about helping people of other religion. Yeah. Or a Hindu organization that goes about and helps people of other religion. Yeah. Any major one?
Yeah, I can think of any. Yeah.
So you have, again, look at the Aztecs. They slaughtered over 80,000 human sacrifices in the course of 1 century, and we've got the bones. That's where we get the count on this stuff. That was the norm. All these other folks, it's us versus everybody else. It's the Greeks and the barbarians, or it's the Romans, and the Vandals. It's the good guys because we're smarter than everybody else, and that's how the world has always been divided. And so, if you're an Incan and the Aztecs captured you, oh great, we got more sacrifices. You're expendable.
Yeah. Wow. This has been an amazing discussion. I wish we could keep going, but I want to move to how do we obtain the goods? All right. So the idea is that, all right, Christianity is true. It's done good for the world, whether you're atheist or a believer. That's just the effects of Christianity. But like I said, in today's culture where we've lost enchantment, as Gould would say, right? We've lost the supernatural, and Christianity is cast in a bad light now. How do we regain people's confidence again? How do we regain the credibility that Christianity once had? And we could go on with several strategies.
Selflessness, like we talked about. I think the church really fumbled, say, during the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because again, even Martin Luther was writing about the bubonic plague, and COVID is one of the reasons why I started researching how the church responded in plague times. But Martin Luther said, "Look, you're not supposed to be foolish, right? You stay inside. You don't tempt God. But if there is an individual who's sick, I'm going to go and minister to that individual, and it's in God's hands whether I get the plague or not." And that has always been the mindset of Christianity. Again, scoop the child up from the river. Is it going to cost me extra money? Am I taking food out of my mouth? Yes, but that is a person who's in the image of God and needs to be redeemed. It costs me something. That kind of response is so powerful. Nobody curses Mother Teresa. Nobody curses Mother Teresa. Mm-hmm. You know, no matter what you say, everybody holds her in high esteem.
And I would say we need to take the final words of Jesus seriously. He said, "All authority in heaven and earth is given to me. So go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them all that Jesus has taught us." Mm-hmm. Right? We got to be teaching all that Jesus has taught to the nations and translate them into actions that will show them that we really serve a living God and we walk the walk as Christ has and as his followers, right? And that's the way to actually lead people and draw them closer to the gospel, the truth of the gospel.
All right. In the next couple minutes that we have remaining, I'm just curious because I know Paul Gould covers this in chapter 6, what I'm calling strategies, right? So he mentions Dreher, Rob,
the Benedict option.
Benedict option. He also mentions Dr. Hunter, the whole faithful presence within. What are you guys' thoughts on that? I know
James Davison Hunter's How to Change the World, right?
Yeah, How to Change the World. Yeah. I love the title of that.
Yeah.
So where do you guys fall there in terms of strategies now, in terms of like boots on the ground type of a thing? Like you said, selflessness. There are certain things that are just what I'm calling basic, like prayer for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Prayer is huge. But with all of that as givens, if we're going to strategize, what are good strategies that you guys want to adopt? And maybe, maybe we have 2 minutes left, but how do we maybe differentiate, or how do we choose between two competing models of culture change? One is saying top to bottom, and one is bottom up.
Yeah.
So you guys want to explain a little bit of?
I would say we have to keep a good balance between both. It's not just either or kind of situation. We need both, top down as well as bottom up. What we need is all of Christ for all of life. Not that he is dissected, that he's only relevant in one sphere of our life, not another. Church must, everything that we do must be an extension of the church, extension of our worship unto God. And I think it's our responsibility to be the light and the salt of the earth that Christ has called us to be, and do that faithfully. So recognizing what God has called us to, being faithful in that. And one thing I would say, regardless of our age, regardless of our ethnicity, regardless of who we are, we need to be understanding our calling and being faithfully available in that space to assume sacrificial responsibilities. Yeah. That's necessary. The Christian way to go up is by going down on the foot of cross and trusting the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the Lord of the resurrection, and he has made us into children of resurrection.
Well, thanks, Jacob. You had the last word there. So you've been listening to Apologetics.com radio, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. Our hope is that you've learned some aspect about the Christian worldview that strengthens your faith and make you want to learn more. Special thanks to my panel, Jacob, Lenny, and to our engineer who makes everything work for us. Until next time, good night.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.